Hello there. Come in out of the rain and sit yourself down by the fire. That's it, closer in. Nights like this have a way of soaking through a man if he spends too long out on the road. No harm in warming yourself properly before we begin. Now, tonight's story carries us down to Waterford, to an old hotel standing at the edge of the city while rain lashes the windows and floodwater gathers in the streets below. It's a tale about a weary investigator looking for nothing more than a cheap room for the night, only to discover that some places don't let go of the past as easily as they should. So, settle yourself in, listen to the crackle of my fireplace, and we'll begin. Rain followed me all the way into Waterford. It started outside Kilkenny and stayed with me the rest of the drive. Heavy rain, the kind that turns headlights into smears and fills every dip in the road with black water. The wipers scraped back and forth across the windscreen, fast enough to blur together. Every few miles, the Morris drifted slightly on the flooded road and made me tighten my grip on the wheel. I'd been driving too long already. 3 days in Dublin had left me exhausted and irritated in equal measure. A fraud investigation that should have taken one afternoon turned into endless interviews, lies, missing paperwork, and a client who suddenly decided honesty was optional whenever it suited him. By the time I reached Waterford, I wanted 2 things: a bed and just silence. The Millbrook Hotel promised both. A guard I knew from Tremor recommended it months earlier after staying there with his wife. Cheap enough, he'd said, old place but comfortable. I knew the name already. Most men in my trade did. The Millbrook Hotel killings had lingered in police conversation for years after they happened. Storm, guests trapped inside, several murders over the course of one night. No one ever officially identified. Then time swallowed most of it. The hotel changed ownership, renovations happened, business resumed. The old case became one of those stories people vaguely remembered but rarely discussed seriously anymore. That suited me fine. I wasn't driving there to investigate murders. I was driving there because I was tired and nearly broke. The hotel appeared through the rain near the edge of the city, 3 stories high, Victorian frontage, warm light glowing through tall windows. The sign outside shone softly through the weather, Millbrook Hotel. The place looked alive. Even through the rain I could see movement behind the front windows, a figure crossing through the dining area perhaps, reflections moving behind glass, warm yellow lighting spilling across the wet stone steps outside. And so I pulled into the gravel entrance and parked close to the front. Rain hammered the roof while I sat there another moment with both hands resting on the wheel. The hotel looked perfectly normal, respectable, even. The sort of place businessmen stayed passing through Waterford. Nothing about it suggested decay or abandonment, and so I grabbed my case from the passenger seat, stepped out into the rain, and hurried toward the entrance. The revolving door turned stiffly beneath my hands. Just age, I suppose. The brass frame resisted slightly as I stepped into the glass compartment and pushed it forward. And this is the part that stayed with me afterwards. While I moved through the revolving door, the hotel beyond the glass still looked perfectly normal. I could see the reception desk, warm lighting, clean carpet, a standing lamp glowing beside the staircase. I even remember seeing movement somewhere deeper inside the lobby, like someone crossing from one corridor into another. Then the revolving door completed its turn, and everything changed. Instantly, the warm light vanished, the carpet darkened beneath my feet. The reception desk ahead of me now sat buried beneath dust. The standing lamp near the staircase had become a dead thing covered in cobwebs. The walls were riddled with damp. The chandelier overhead glowed weakly through layers of grime. It felt less like entering another room and more like stepping backward through time into a dead version of the building. I stopped walking. I just stood there. The smell hit me a second later. The damp timber, old carpet, standing water somewhere deep inside the hotel. It wasn't the smell of a functioning business. Straight away I turned back toward the revolving door behind me, and through the glass, the outside world still looked normal. Rain sliding down the windows, streetlights beyond, the ordinary modern world still sitting only feet away, but Inside that lobby, everything had rotted. I stood there listening quietly. I couldn't hear any voices. I couldn't hear any music, and there was no movement. Only the distant sound of rain striking windows somewhere deep inside the building. The silence bothered me more than the decay. Abandoned buildings still make noise. Wind rattles things loose. Dead wood creaking, pipes knocking. This place felt as though it had stopped breathing. "Hello," I called, my voice carried across the lobby and faded near the staircase. No answer came back. I walked toward the reception desk. Dust covered the counter thick enough that my fingers dragged lines through it when I touched the surface. Behind the desk hung rows of old brass room keys on hooks. Heavy, old-fashioned keys with faded tags attached. A ledger sat open beneath a dead, green-shaded lamp. I turned it toward me, names, dates, room numbers. The ink had browned with age. So I flipped through several pages. The most recent proper entry sat decades earlier. I couldn't make sense of this, so I looked around again. At that stage, I still searched for ordinary explanations. Maybe I'd entered some closed-off wing accidentally. Maybe the hotel only used newer sections now. Perhaps the storm knocked out power and half the building sat unused during repairs. But those explanations weakened the longer I stood there. The dust was too thick. The smell was too settled. This place wasn't abandoned last week. And so, curiosity got the better of me. I picked up my case and wandered further into the lobby. Old black and white photographs lined the walls near the staircase. Wedding guests posing beside vintage cars. Hotel staff standing proudly outside the entrance decades earlier. Several frames hung crooked. One had cracked glass running directly through the middle of a bride's face. Further down the wall sat a bronze plaque, darkened, nearly black, from time. I wiped the dust from it with my sleeve, in memory of those lost during the storm. The smaller writing beneath had faded badly. The Millbrook killings again. I remembered reading about them years earlier while waiting outside a courthouse in Dublin. One article claimed the killer moved room to room during the storm while guests trapped themselves inside. Another insisted the murderer escaped before Gardaí arrived. Nobody ever fully agreed on what had happened. That usually means panic. People remember fear badly. I turned away from the plaque and headed back toward the entrance. I had no intention of staying in the dead hotel all night. The revolving door waited exactly where I left it, and through the glass beyond it, I could still see the rain and the streetlights outside. I stepped into the revolving compartment and pushed. As it turned, I watched the world outside carefully through the curved glass. The street, the rain, the normal world. Everything still looked exactly as it should, and then I stepped out and found myself facing the dusty reception desk again. Same dead chandelier, same rotting carpet, same silence. I turned slowly around. The revolving door stood behind me. Beyond the glass, rain crawled on the windows outside exactly as before. I stared at it for a long while. Then I walked back toward it immediately. This time I kept my eyes fixed on the outside world while I pushed through. The revolving door turned. The rain remained visible through the glass. The streetlights were there, and then I stepped out. Dusty lobby. Again. I could feel my grip tightening on the case handle. I walked to the nearest front window instead and shoved hard against the frame. The latch already hung open. The window refused to move, so I tried another. No joy. The third lifted barely an inch before jamming solid. I stepped back, breathing harder now, though I tried not to show it. "All right," I muttered quietly, "very funny." The hotel answered with silence. There had to be another exit somewhere. Hotels always had service entrances. I picked up my case and headed down the corridor beside reception. The air turned colder immediately. Wallpaper peeled away from walls in damp strips. Side rooms opened into abandoned lounges where furniture sat beneath dusty white sheets. One room held an old piano with warped keys exposed beneath a torn cloth cover. At the end of the corridor stood a green-painted fire exit door. I shoved the metal bar. The door opened inward. Another corridor waited behind it. It was long, it was narrow, No outside air came through. I looked back over my shoulder. The lobby now seemed farther away than it should have. Then the music drifted softly through the hotel. Ballroom music, old style, cracking slightly like it came through damaged speakers or an old gramophone. I stood listening until it stopped abruptly halfway through a note. Then the silence returned, heavier than before. I continued down the corridor slowly. Photographs hung along the walls there too, wedding guests smiling stiffly at the camera, men smoking outside the hotel entrance beneath summer sunlight from another generation. Then the corridor opened into a tiled rear passage near another exit. Water spread slowly across the floor there from rain blowing halfway through the cracked open back door. That was where I saw the body. A man lay crumpled near the threshold with one arm trapped awkwardly beneath him. I lowered my case carefully and approached. Middle-aged, dark suit, grey at the temples. His throat had been cut deeply enough to soak the front of his shirt completely. The body looked fresh. It was far too fresh. Rainwater still moved around the edge of his coat, and then I noticed the shoes. Mud coated one shoe nearly to the ankle. The other remained clean. I looked toward the back door. It stood partly open. Wind pushed rain through the gap every few seconds. One muddy shoe meant he almost escaped outside before somebody had dragged him back in. I crouched lower beside the body. A luggage tag rested near his hand. Seamus Quinn, Waterford. I looked down along the passage. Still no movement or footsteps. No sound except rain and the old building settling overhead. My torch sat back near reception beside the ledger. I had left it there earlier without thinking. I stood and headed back through the corridor to retrieve it. The walk took less than a minute. When I returned, holding the torch in one hand, Seamus Quinn was gone. The body, the case, everything. Only blood remained across the wet tiles. I stood staring at the empty floor. Then, somewhere above me inside the hotel, an elevator bell rang softly through the darkness. The elevator bell rang again somewhere above me. Soft, it was patient. I stood in the rear passage, looking at the blood on the tiles where Seamus Quinn had been lying moments earlier. Rain still pushed through the crack beneath the back door in thin silver streams, but nothing else moved. I swept the torch along the corridor. Empty. No place nearby where a body could have been dragged quickly out of sight. No secondary doors standing open. No footprints fresh enough to follow through the water. The only sound came from somewhere higher in the hotel. The music. The faint ballroom music drifting through the walls. Again. I looked upward toward the ceiling, then toward the corridor leading back to the lobby. At that stage, I still believed there had to be a rational explanation sitting underneath everything. Drugs in the air. Exhaustion. Somebody playing tricks. A damaged building affecting my senses of direction somehow. None of the explanations felt convincing, but the alternative felt worse. I picked up my case and headed back toward the lobby. The old lift stood beside the staircase behind a black iron gate. Up close, it looked even older than I first thought. The brass frame had gone dull in places. Dust covered most of the metal, apart from the handle itself, where the surface looked recently disturbed. That small detail settled badly for me. I slid the gate aside. Inside waited an old cage lift with another folding grille across the entrance. Weak amber bulbs glowed overhead. There was a faint smell of oil and old steel from the interior. 3 buttons sat beside the grille. Ground floor, rooms, ballroom. The ballroom button glowed softly. I stared at it for a second before pressing it. The lift jerked violently upward almost immediately. The sudden movement made my shoulder strike the wall beside me. Cables groaned somewhere overhead while the machinery rattled through the shaft. As we climbed, I noticed scratches cut into the brass panels beside the controls. They didn't look like random marks. Repeated gouges crossing over one another in uneven groups. I leaned closer with the torch. Some marks curved sharply downward near the ends. Buttons. Metal coat buttons scraping during a struggle, perhaps. The lift shuddered again, then stopped. The grille slid open stiffly. A corridor stretched ahead beneath flickering ceiling lamps. The air smelled heavier up here. Musty wallpaper, bad timber, old smoke trapped in the fabric somewhere, water stains spread across the ceiling overhead like dark rivers, and beneath it all sat the music. It was still faint and still somewhere nearby. I stepped out carrying the torch in one hand and my case in the other. The corridor carpet swallowed most of my footsteps. Old muddy stains marked the fabric here and there beneath layers of dust. Several guest room doors stood partly open, revealing dark interiors beyond. One room held suitcases stacked neatly beside the bed. Another still had a half-filled glass sitting on the bedside table beneath a thick coat of grime. I stepped outside one doorway and swept the torch through the room. There was no movement, there was no sign of recent use. Just the strange feeling that people had left it in the middle of ordinary routines and never returned. The music grew louder near the end of the corridor. That was where the ballroom doors stood. One hung crooked on damaged hinges, the other remained half open. I stepped through carefully. The ballroom stretched almost the full width of the building. Even abandoned, the place still carried traces of former wealth. A cracked glass ceiling arched high overhead above the dance floor. Rotting streamers and paper decorations sagged from ceiling beams blackened by damp. Long dining tables surrounded the floor beneath stained white cloths, wedding decorations. The storm that night happened during a wedding reception. That became obvious immediately. Champagne glasses still sat on several tables. One chair lay overturned beside the dance floor. A woman's shoe rested beneath another table near the far wall. I moved deeper into the room slowly while the music drifted softly around me. Place cards still remained scattered across the tables. Mr. and Mrs. Keeley, Tom and Sheila Brogan, Evelyn and Fergus Riley, Margaret O'Toole. The names gave shape to the dead. That matters more than people realize during investigations. A body feels distant until it belongs to somebody with a name and a life attached to it. I reached the far side of the ballroom where the luggage had been stacked near the wall. Most cases still carried travel labels: Grania Muldoon, Seamus Quinn, Maeve Keeley. The same names appearing repeatedly now. I crouched beside a pile of old papers scattered near one table: room invoices, menus, receipts, then a water-damaged newspaper clipping folded beneath them. Most of the article had rotted away beyond reading, but one line remained visible. Authorities continue search for hotel killer. I let the clipping fall back where I found it. The music stopped. Abruptly, silence spread through the ballroom, then laughter echoed somewhere overhead. The sort of laugh somebody gives after whiskey and dancing. I looked up, but I couldn't see anything. A second later, footsteps crossed the corridor outside the ballroom. Straight away I turned toward the sound. By the time I got to the hallway, the footsteps had already faded deeper into the hotel. I followed. The corridor beyond the ballroom bent toward another wing lined with service doors. Several stood partly open, revealing storage areas and laundry rooms beyond. Then the torchlight caught something black lying beside one doorway. A pair of large, leather work gloves. I crouched beside them carefully, porter gloves by the looks of them, thick leather built for carrying luggage or coal, dark stains soaked into the material around the fingers and palms. Blood. One glove lay partly inside out, the lining twisted awkwardly near the wrist. I studied them a moment longer before looking toward the nearby service door. Locked. No outside handle. That's interesting. If hotel staff used hidden passages through the building, somebody familiar with those routes could have moved across floors without being seen easily. I left the gloves where they were and continued down the corridor. The atmosphere changed subtly the deeper I went. The hotel no longer felt entirely empty. The torch beam caught movement now and then at the edge of corridors, shadows crossing distant doorways, reflections in cracked mirrors that disappeared when I looked directly toward them. Then I heard dancing overhead. Footsteps, many pairs moving slowly across a wooden floor somewhere above me. I continued on until room numbers appeared along the walls. Room 9, room 11, room 12, then further down, room 14. Unlike the others, the door stood fully shut. The brass number still gleamed faintly beneath the dust. I walked toward it slowly. The hand resisted slightly when I tried. Locked. Then I noticed the key sitting in the lock itself. That immediately bothered me. People rarely lock doors and leave keys behind them unless something interrupted them. I turned the key and pushed the door inward. The smell inside sat heavier than anywhere else in the hotel. Old blood, damp fabric, aged wood. The torchlight moved slowly across the room. An overturned chair near the wardrobe, a smashed bedside lamp, curtains hanging partly torn from the rail. Dark stains soaked the carpet. Then the bodies. The man lay beside the bed with a knife buried deep in his chest. The woman lay several feet away, nearer the doorway. I stepped inside carefully. The luggage tag beside the wardrobe identified the man immediately. Eddie Keeley. Another luggage case rested beside the wardrobe opposite the bed. I moved the torch toward it and saw Maeve Keeley. I swept the light slowly across the room. The place looked as though somebody had fought desperately to get out alive. The overturned chair near the wardrobe, the smashed lamp beside the bed. Blood spread across the carpet and uneven streaks leading from one side of the room to the other. At first glance, the scene looked straightforward enough. The killer entered the room. The struggle followed. Eddie tried to fight back. Maeve tried reaching the door. Neither made it. That fit the old stories better. Guests trapped inside the hotel during the storm while somebody moved room to room through the building. I knelt beside Eddie first, then near Maeve. The wounds looked vicious on both of them. Vast, messy, and nothing careful about them. I raised the torch slowly and studied the room again. But something still bothered me. Not enough to explain properly yet, just small details refusing to settle neatly in my head. The blood near the doorway, the position of the furniture, the way the struggle crossed the room. I stood again and looked toward the smashed bedside lamp. Then the lamp flickered, alive, very briefly. Yellow light flashed across the walls for half a second. Another lamp near the wardrobe glowed faintly afterward. The curtains stirred despite the windows remaining shut. Music drifted slowly upward through the floor below. I backed slowly into the corridor again. Then heavy footsteps thundered overhead. They were running, they were fast, crossing directly above room 14. I followed the sound down the corridor. I stopped near the far corner beneath the flickering chandelier, and there, lying alone in the middle of the carpet, sat a wedding bouquet, fresh white flowers, rain still clinging to the petals. I studied it while the torch beam moved unsteadily across the walls. Then somebody laughed nearby, close enough to sound almost beside me. And a second later, footsteps hurried away once more through the dark corridors of the Millbrook Hotel. I went after the footsteps immediately. The bouquet remained behind me beneath the flickering chandelier while I followed the sound deeper into the hotel. The footsteps ahead faded in and out between the walls, sometimes close enough that I expected someone to appear around the next corner, sometimes distant enough to sound like they came from another floor entirely. The corridors twisted, more than corridors should. Hallways closed in unexpectedly between sections of guest rooms. Service doors appeared every few yards along the walls. Most stood partly open, revealing more storage rooms and more laundry areas beyond. I slowed down. The smell had changed. I was getting soap. I was getting coal dust, wet linen staff areas. I pushed open one narrow door and swept the torch through it. Shelves lined walls from floor to ceiling. Towels sat collapsed in damp sacks. Cleaning bottles gathered dust near the back wall. The room looked untouched for years. Another doorway opened into an old laundry room containing rusted carts and abandoned ironing equipment. Then I noticed it. A narrow panel near the skirting board, partly hidden beneath peeling paper. I pressed against it carefully. The panel jerked inward. A hidden corridor waited behind it. It was narrow and dark, built into the walls of the hotel itself. I stepped inside, very carefully. This passage felt colder than the rest of the building. Cold plumbing and wiring lined the walls overhead, while the floorboards creaked softly beneath my shoes. Small vents and narrow openings appeared along the walls every few yards. One overlooked the ballroom below. Another gave a partial view into the corridor outside room 14. I stood there quietly a moment, letting the shape of the hotel finally settle properly in my mind. So this was how somebody moved through the building unseen. It wasn't magic, or impossible disappearances, hidden staff, passageways, the kind old hotels sometimes carried inside their walls. I continued deeper into the passageway, then I found the barricade. Furniture had been shoved tightly against the stairwell door, chairs, a cabinet, part of a broken table wedged hard beneath the handle. I brought the torch closer. There were deep scratches covering the wood around the lock. These scratches weren't neat. They looked desperate, people clawing at the door in panic. At first glance, I assumed the barricade existed because of the storm outside. Then I noticed the marks across the floorboards. The furniture had been pushed from the stairwell side inward toward the corridor, not the other way around. I stood there for a while studying the barricade quietly. The guests hadn't trapped themselves inside against the weather. They had trapped somebody else inside the hotel. That changed the feeling of the place immediately. Until then, part of me still treated the Millbrook as an old unsolved case buried beneath rumor and ghost stories. Standing beside that barricade made the fear inside the hotel feel real in a different way. The guests hadn't simply panicked. They had organized, or at least tried to. I looked again at the furniture jammed against the stairwell door and pictured the night more clearly. Floodwater outside, telephone lines failing, bodies appearing in different parts of the hotel while the storm cut people off from the city beyond. They were trying to seal sections of the building, trying to keep whoever was moving through the hotel away from them. That explained the barricades. One group of guests closes off a corridor, another blocks a stairwell. Somebody drags furniture against service doors while the killer keeps slipping through parts of the hotel nobody else fully understands. And all the while, the storm outside keeps everybody trapped there together. That was the real horror of it. Not people willingly locking themselves inside with the killer. People trying desperately to survive long enough for morning to come. I stepped back into the hidden corridor and continued onward. The passage narrowed further ahead until I had to angle my shoulders slightly in places. Water dripped steadily through the cracks in the ceiling overhead. Then the torchlight caught movement ahead. A woman crouched behind a laundry cart, gripping the metal frame tightly with both hands. I stopped immediately. Grania Muldoon. This time I recognized her properly from the ballroom photographs and the luggage tags downstairs. The scene around her looked clearer than the other strange moments inside the hotel. The room no longer appeared abandoned. Lamps on overhead. Steam drifted from hot pipes along the walls. Voices shouted somewhere deeper inside the hotel through the storm. Grania breathed quickly through her nose, trying desperately not to make noise. Then footsteps approached outside the laundry room. Creeping, slowly. Grania pressed herself harder against the wall, tears streaking down her face. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Silence followed. And it wasn't ordinary silence either. It was the sort where somebody is standing only feet away, listening, waiting. Grania squeezed her eyes shut tightly. The lamps overhead were flickering. Then the entire scene just vanished. The steam disappeared first, then the voices, then Grania herself. The laundry room returned to darkness and damp decay around me. I remained standing there for another few seconds, trying to settle my thoughts properly. The replay felt clearer now, more direct. Less like random hauntings and more like fragments of memory trapped inside the building itself. I continued deeper through the passage. Then the torchlight caught something lying further ahead on the floorboards. Those large porter gloves again. I stopped walking immediately. I knew they were the same pair. One glove still sat partly twisted inward near the wrist exactly as before. The dark blood stains across the leather hadn't changed. Even the position matched what I remembered from earlier. I stood staring at them. The hotel was moving pieces of the night around me. Not randomly either, almost as though it wanted certain things seen in a certain order. I crouched slowly and picked up one of the gloves again. The leather had stiffened from dried blood. Up close, the twisted inner lining near the wrist looked more pronounced than before, as though the glove had been pulled off in a hurry. I turned it carefully in the torchlight. Something moved faintly inside the lining beneath my fingers. I worked 2 fingers carefully into the glove. Metal touched my fingertips. I pulled it free slowly. It was a gold wedding ring. Inside the band sat an inscription: Maeve and Eddie. I analysed it quietly while the torchlight moved softly across the narrow walls around me. The ring had slipped inside the glove lining accidentally, lost rather than hidden. I looked at the gloves again, then back toward the corridor leading in the direction of room 14. My mind returned to the upstairs scene. The bodies, the hidden passages, the porter gloves, the barricades. The old assumptions surrounding the killings no longer sat together as comfortably as they had earlier. The original investigators likely saw what everybody else would have seen during the aftermath: a dead married couple among several other victims, a hotel consumed by panic, a killer apparently moving unseen through service doors during the storm. You see, simple explanations become attractive during chaotic investigations, especially when somebody involved wants the nightmare finished quickly. I leaned back slowly against the wall, trying to reconstruct the pieces again in my head. Eddie near the bed, Maeve near the doorway. Blood spread across both sides of the room, the struggle crossing between them. I considered the porter gloves again. Large gloves, heavy work gloves, the kind usually worn by men. My first instinct settled naturally on Eddie. The ring carried both their names, and the original investigation clearly leaned toward a male killer moving through the hotel. It fit too neatly, maybe too neatly. I remembered Maeve again, lying near the doorway, then Eddie beside the bed. Something about that room still resisted the obvious answer. Not enough to explain fully yet, but enough to unsettle me. I stood slowly, the ring remained cold in my palm. Then I said, quietly into the darkness, Eddie and Maeve. The reaction inside the hotel came instantly. Every light along the hallway burst alive all at once, with blinding yellow light. Ballroom music exploded through the building below so loudly that the floor vibrated beneath my feet. Doors slammed somewhere overhead. Thunder cracked outside hard enough to shake dust from the beams. And from deep inside the Millbrook Hotel, people began screaming. I turned toward the sound. The corridor behind me had changed. Wallpaper hung clean beneath glowing lamps. Doors stood open along the hallway. Frightened guests hurried between rooms, carrying suitcases and blankets, handbags, coats, and anything else they had managed to grab. Voices echoed through the building over the storm outside. The hotel was replaying the storm night fully. The whole night had come loose. I moved back toward the main corridors while the building changed around me. People rushed past without seeing me. A porter dragged furniture toward the stairwell. 2 men argued about flooded streets outside. A crying woman held somebody's sleeve and asked where her husband had gone. At first, there was still order to the fear. People were trying to think, trying to survive. A scream came from above. After that, the panic spread faster. The ballroom doors downstairs stood open, light spilling out into the corridor. Music was still playing inside. It was too cheerful for what was happening around it. I stepped into the ballroom. The wedding reception had returned completely. Couples danced beneath bright chandeliers while cigarette smoke drifted over crowded tables. Waiters carried trays of drinks between guests. Rain clashed against the tall windows hard enough to blur the city outside. At the center of the room stood Eddie and Maeve Keeley, alive, laughing together. I watched them closely. Eddie looked tired around the eyes. Maeve looked calm, alert, and comfortable in the room. She had the manner of someone who noticed everything while pretending to notice very little. I took my eyes off them and looked around. Then the music cut off. A shout came from near the ballroom entrance. People rushed toward the door. A man staggered backward against the bar with both hands clamped to his throat. Blood poured between his fingers and down the front of his shirt. Panic broke through the room. Tables overturned, guests shouted over one another. Somebody yelled that another body had been found upstairs. The replay carried me from one part of the hotel to the other. Furniture being pushed across corridors, guests barricaded doors. Men searched rooms in pairs, while others tried to calm people who had already gone beyond listening. The storm outside worsened by the minute. The cracking thunder shook the chandeliers overhead. The killings continued through it all. Somebody moved through the hotel while panic kept everyone looking in the wrong direction. In one corridor, a woman sobbed inside a linen cupboard while another guest covered her mouth to keep her quiet. In another room, an old man knelt beside a bed, whispering prayers while his wife stared at the door. Guests hammered at swollen windows that wouldn't open. A man tried to force a side exit while another shouted at him to leave it and help with the barricade. The hotel carried me onward. Tom Brogan and Fergus Riley shoved a cabinet hard against a stairwell entrance while voices shouted somewhere below. The killer's downstairs. No, upstairs. Keep that door shut. Nobody knew where the danger was anymore. Fear had taken command of the building. The replay carried me into another guest room. Margaret O'Toole backed slowly across the carpet while a figure approached through the darkness with a knife held low beside one leg. The movement was calm. That's what unsettled me most. There was no rushing in it, no shouting, no chaos. Only a steady advance while the rest of the hotel fell apart. The scene dissolved around me. I kept moving through the corridors as pieces of the night unfolded one after the next. A suitcase abandoned halfway down a hallway. A lamp burning beside an open bedroom door, a handprint smeared in blood along a wall near the kitchens. The Millbrook groaned around all of it like the building still carried the weight of that night inside its walls. At last, the replay drew me back toward room 14. This part came clearer than the rest. Eddie stood beside the bed holding the porter gloves. Blood stained the leather. Maeve stood near the doorway watching him. Rain battered the windows behind them. Eddie looked pale with disbelief. "You," he said. Maeve said nothing. He looked down at the gloves again, then at his own hands. His wedding ring sat plainly on his finger. "These aren't mine," he said. Maeve watched him. Eddie looked toward her left hand. No ring, only the pale mark where one had been. He understood enough then. Maybe not all of it, but enough. "These are yours," he said quietly. Maeve gave the faintest, crooked smile, small, almost private. Eddie stared at her as if his mind couldn't reach the end of the thought. "My God, Maeve," he said. She didn't respond. He lifted the gloves. "Porter gloves," he said. "Big enough for any man in this place." The storm battered the window behind her. Eddie's voice grew rougher. "Is that what this is?" he said. "Leave them bloody and let the guards chase some poor bastard from the staff." "You always did talk too much," she said. Eddie took a step back. "You killed them," he said. Maeve looked tired now, truly tired. "I was exhausted," she said. "Of me?" asked Eddie. "Of all of it," she replied. He shook his head, slowly, unable to take in the woman standing in front of him. Maeve looked past him toward the room, the bed, the life they had been pretending to share. "Tonight made it easy," she said. The violence came quickly after that. Eddie lunged first. The knife flashed between them. Maeve was struck near the doorway. Blood spread across the front of her dress. Eddie tried to pull away, but she came at him. The struggle crossed the room. The chair overturned. The bedside lamp smashed against the floor. Eddie fell backward against the bed as Maeve plunged the knife into his chest. She reeled backwards, blood on her hands from both her and him, and she collapsed beside the doorway. Eddie had collapsed beside the bed, and that was how I found them. Then the room returned to ruin. Dust settled across the furniture. The warm light died. The ruined version of room 14 stood around me again. I was alone inside the dead hotel, rain tapping softly against the windows, but nothing else moved. I removed Maeve's wedding ring from my pocket. The gold looked dull beneath the weak corridor light. I knelt by the doorway where she had fallen and placed the ring gently on the floorboards. The hotel quietened gradually. The ballroom music faded first. The footsteps stopped. The voices disappeared. Even the knocking pipes inside the walls fell silent. The Millbrook felt tired now, like a place reaching the end of a very long night. I stayed there a little while, listening. No screams, no music, no running feet. I stood and made my way back toward the lobby. The corridors remained steady as I walked. Doors stayed where they belonged. Room numbers no longer changed. The air still smelled old, but the building had gone calm. By the time I reached the revolving door, the hotel was completely silent. I stepped into the glass compartment and pushed. The revolving door turned smoothly beneath my hands. This time I stepped out into morning. The storm had passed. Cars moved along the street outside. Water dripped from gutters into puddles below. A bakery van rolled slowly past the entrance. I turned around. The Millbrook Hotel stood behind me, fully alive and perfectly ordinary. Light glowed through the polished windows. Curtains hung neatly behind the glass. Smoke drifted from the chimneys overhead. I stared at the building, and curiosity got the better of me. I walked back toward the entrance and made my way through the revolving door. Warm air greeted me inside the lobby. The reception desk gleamed beneath proper electric lighting. A woman in uniform looked up from her ledger and smiled politely. "Checking in, sir?" she asked. Eventually I said, "Yes. Name's Declan Shaw." The receptionist checked the ledger. "We've your reservation here, Mr. Shaw," she said. She reached behind the desk and lifted down a brass key. "Room 14, she said. My eyes stayed on the number slightly too long. The receptionist noticed. "Problem with the room, sir?" she asked. "No," I said. "No problem." When I got there, the room looked ordinary. Fresh bedding, clean carpet, dry wallpaper. Morning light spread softly across the bed from the windows overlooking the street. I placed my case beside the wardrobe and removed my coat. Voices drifted from downstairs. Cutlery clinked faintly in the dining room. Somebody laughed near the staircase. Normal sounds. I went to the bathroom and turned on the tap. Water rattled through the pipes before pouring into the sink. I washed my face slowly and looked at myself in the mirror. Tired eyes, rain-soaked hair, a man badly in need of sleep. Nothing more. I shut off the tap. The room behind me had gone quiet. I stepped back into the bedroom. Maeve Keeley's wedding ring sat on the floor beside the bed. Small, still, exactly where I'd left it in the dead version of the room. I looked at it. Then, slowly, the ring disappeared. The fire's gone to ash now, and the night has grown long. That's all from our little fireside for this evening. If you found a bit of company in the shadows of this story, I'd be grateful if you'd let me know. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and perhaps share a thought in the comments. I read them all, and they keep the fire burning. Until the next time the wind calls us back to the road, take care of yourselves.